am live. It is the 1st of March 2024, and I'm reading out of Speaking from the Heart, extracts of a book about and from Joan Marshall Grant, who was a writer, an author. She wrote books about her previous incarnations, 7 books in fact. The Winged Pharaoh was very famous. She is here describing, and her life is described by others. It was edited by Nicola Bennett, Jane Law and Sophia Rostov. It is Ethics, Reincarnation and What It Means to be Human. We are now, she lived from 1907 till 1989. We're now in part 3 of this book. It's, as I said, it's extracts about her life, because I read her early autobiography already in our playlist, and I read it in German as well. So I'm not reading the early parts. Part 3, 1958 till 1970, France. Psychiatry and Past Lives, Chapter 10. As Joan became more involved in helping the people who turned up on her doorstep, and more did so as the war progressed, producing the books that largely paid for it all became harder. She was becoming more interested in using her insights and farm memory to be of therapeutic help to people, and indeed planned to establish a center for this work. Supported by government funding, the plans were interrupted only by the unexpected death of Alex Clarkson, the psychiatrist whose involvement in the project was essential to getting official blessing. Joan found herself bringing back a lifetime spent in civilization she first believed was Atlantis, and then decided was pre-Columbian South America. The Great Rain was to be her most important book, but as the sessions went on she became depressed and felt the lack of positive, ethical message she always wanted to convey to her readers. Eventually, Treliadon had to be sold in Cornwall, and desperately short of funds, the Beatties went first to London, to a flat in the Albany of Piccadilly, then to Cornwall, Ireland, and other temporary nests, as what Joan would call them, in Sussex and the south coast. Late in 1957, they arrived at Beaulieu in Hampshire, where Charles had been appointed curator of the Motor Museum, a job for which he had neither experience nor aptitude. It was here that Joan met Dennis Kelsey, a psychiatrist who had discovered to his surprise that under hypnosis some of his patients would describe being born, and some seemed to be recalling conception, as if an individual's consciousness was independent of the workings of a physical body. When he came across Joan's book, he was convinced that her farm memory was an exceptional example of an ability he had evinced in many people when put into hypnotic trance. It was a meeting that was to change both their lives. They realized with Dennis' experience and qualifications and Joan's ability to tune into other people's previous lives, they could do important work together. Events moved fast. Joan left Charles for Dennis. They set up a practice in London in 1960. She and Dennis were married. Directly after the war, Joan had persuaded her publishers to commission a travel book. Vague Vacations describes the pleasures of escaping the drab realities of post-war Britain, real food in small French towns, and entertaining encounters with the inhabitants, dead and alive. Researching the second book, A Lot to Remember, introduced Joan and Dennis, or Kay as she called him, not only to the lot, but also to a valley in the Corrèze, with a fairy tale village made of warm red sandstone called Collonges-la-Rouge. They bought a small house with a barn attached, converted them with the help of local craftsmen, and in 1963 moved out to live full-time in France. Here they could offer patients consultations in hospitable and lovely surroundings, far from their daily problems. They aimed to work fast, unlike practitioners of classic psychoanalysis. For once, a past life trauma, or woogly, as Joan would put it, had been re-experienced and integrated, it lost its power to disrupt the present life. It was at the suggestion of Joan's old friend Noel Langley, who was living in Virginia Beach, that Joan and Dennis and Moni Corson, who helped them set up Colongas and was studying with them at the time, gave a series of lectures for ARF, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, dedicated to the work of Edgar Cayce in the fall of 1964. Professor Ian Stevenson, founding director of the Division of Personality Studies at the University of Virginia, whose investigations into past life claims, particularly in children, gave them common ground, invited them also to give the lectures in Charlottesville. Joan and Dennis each delivered 4 lectures on different aspects of reincarnation, Dennis describing individual cases and analysis. They revealed both evidence for reincarnation and the philosophy that they used to help people to live more happily in their present life. Joan recounted her usual experiences and insights, the source of many of the ethical principles that were the linchpin of their psychotherapeutic work. But before they crossed the Atlantic, Joan was asked to lecture in England. She began the talk she gave at Tatworth in Surrey that spring, with some stories from her childhood, quoted in Chapter 1, and went on to give one of her clearest explanations of the physical and non-physical aspects of the human psyche, according to her experiences and beliefs. This half of that lecture, she had been describing training her supra-physical body to play golf when her physical body was out of action, serves as an introduction to 3 of the lectures she gave in the US later that year. Here is the Tatworth lecture. The supra-physical body is the source of what we usually call instinct, which is the fruit of experience gained through the 5 senses by the supra-physical during its personal history of many thousands of years. It is also the source of an individual's aptitudes and of the efficiency with which the brain functions as the correlator of data fed into it from various levels of consciousness. My supra-physical body did not know how to play golf, but found it an easy skill to acquire, because it had already learned muscle coordination through such activities as throwing javelins and shooting arrows in Egypt, and becoming adept with a discus in Greece. Had none of my earlier bodies acquired a measure of skill in athletics, my supra-physical body would have been unable to instruct its physical component, and I would have had to practice much longer before becoming reasonably proficient. There are many occasions, of course, when the skills of a supra-physical body cannot be manifested in its current physical component, which may be suffering from limitations due to immaturity, injury, or old age. For instance, try as I would, I could not make my female 2-year-old body run along the hailing sands with the effortless speed acquired some 2,000 years earlier as a Greek runner. A fact which, because I could not fully understand it, caused me furious frustration. It's entirely unnecessary to allow the supraphysical to be affected by defects of the physical body. But unfortunately, this quite often occurs, because the majority of human beings in our abject material civilization have been brainwashed until they sincerely believe that they exist only in 3 dimensions. On this account, they direct a disproportionate amount of their vital energies into the 3-dimensional field, with the result that the physical, instead of the far wiser physical, temporarily becomes the dominant factor. It is only too commonplace, for instance, to see a man whose physical body has a plaster leg still limping, even though he has shifted to a different level of activity during sleep. And this self-inflicted and utterly needless handicap may even persist after the body has died, death being a process similar to the sloughing of a snake's skin, or shedding of a snake. look how long it has been muted, so I briefly repeat. Oh, never mind. Excuse me, sorry, technical. So, I know how easy it is to get carried along on the muddy current of materialistic thought. For only 5 years ago, I was temporarily the victim of this inept way of thinking. I had been helping to embalm the body of a great friend of mine, who had died suddenly of a heart attack. The embalming, I must add, had no ritual significance and was performed merely because the funeral was delayed on account of a hold-up at the crematorium. I suppose it was difficult for me not to confuse Hugh with his physical body, especially after assisting at these sombre offices, for when I saw him the next day I momentarily failed to recognize him. Instead of being bald as he had been during the 15 years I had known him, he now had luxuriant black hair. He recognized that I was startled and rebuked me briskly by shouting with laughter and saying, "Good God, Joan, did you think I would be such a bloody fool as to be bald up here?" There is more factor about the body I should like to mention. It is neither superior nor inferior to the soul, for they are of equal importance as vehicles through which the spirit gains experience. I stress this because it is all still widely believed, a belief fostered by the misguided monastic discipline, that the progress of a soul is accelerated by denying the body its sensory pleasures. This is an error. Neither celibacy, nor fasting, nor kneeling in prayer on stone floors can do anything more, however sincerely such disciplines are pursued, than impose on a future body of the same series the appropriate, self-inflicted physical disability, such as importance, duodenal cancer, a duodenal ulcer, or a tendency to housemaid knees. After all, one would not commend a horseman for believing that he would ride further and faster if he starved, or failed to exercise, or otherwise maltreated his unfortunate horse. From this point, I think I shall be able to express myself more clearly if I use the terms for soul and spirit, which through usage have become familiar to me. The integral for the spirit and the persona for the soul. It will then be easier for me to differentiate when necessary between the current personality, the present persona, and an earlier one in the same series, a previous persona. Each persona in a series is a projection onto a different level of consciousness, of a part, but only of a part, of an individual's integral, which contains the distillate of his total experience. The wisdom contained in one's integral should be easily accessible, but nowadays its existence is by the majority of people so studiously ignored that, even when dimly recognized, it seems so remote that they frequently confuse it with some muddled concept of deity. It is through the persona series that we acquire our character, that collection of attitudes which inspire our behavior, and which result from having chosen in innumerable occasions one course of action in preference to another. A persona evolves only by the interaction with other personae, either human or animal, and this process cannot be circumvented by shunning human affection or simply by worshipping some concept of deity. When a persona experiences real empathy for another persona, he himself increases by the exact amount that his degree of empathy allowed him to become one with his neighbor. In fact, spiritual growth depends upon the ability to form genuine love relationships, whether it be one so far-reaching that it gives joy for millennia, or brief as a smile of real warmth given to a stranger on a bus. But should the persona try to increase its stature by some form of one-upmanship, he will in fact only diminish himself by the precise degree that he has tried to make his opponent feel smaller. This is the reason why to try to live by power instead of by loving is, in the long run, ineffective. After the body dies, the persona usually spends a period enjoying a supra-physical environment, a personal heaven, where he is assisted by those linked with him in affection to assess and, if necessary, to re-evaluate the experience of that particular lifetime. He is then ready to merge with his integral. In a book called Return to Elysium, I have described such a period, which occurred to a previous persona of my own, a woman called Lucina, who lived in Greece, later going to Rome in the 2nd century BC. The method I used to recall her experiences was the same that I have used for 6 other books, the far memory by which one can draw on the information contained in one's integral. Even someone who does not believe in the possibility of a heaven will reach this destination, provided he has more far-sighted friends to share their heaven with him. But if he has been so concerned with the material aspects of his lifetime to have neither the time nor the inclination to make real love relationships, one of 2 things will happen to him. He may get stuck in a thought form based on incidents of his lifetime, which had a powerful emotional content of fear or hatred or guilt, which in essence is self-hatred. Or he may remain on the supra-physical level of some part of his late environment, because he will not accept that there is anywhere else to go. Here, in a self-centered, self-created hell, he remains frozen in time, which for him has no relevance until he becomes so lonely, so bored with what in fact is a supra-sulk, motivated by the arrogance of separation, that at last he listens to one of the people whose job it is to assist such melancholy delinquents. I must emphasize that a ghost of this type is an entirely different matter to someone who happens to appear in a supra-physical body, virtually on a physical level, as for instance the Irish priest did when he appeared at my bedside, or I used when visiting the doctor's wife in hospital. This type of ghost may be a nuisance to the inhabitants of a house which he haunts, but he will be far more of a nuisance to a later persona of his series. It need not be the next one, for a really stubborn ghost may stay out of circulation for centuries while the rest of his team goes on without him. Separatism has made him refuse assistance, but eventually he becomes so desperate that he deigns to appeal for help to the individual who is both a separate persona and yet, because he belongs to the same series, is also part of himself. This is often, though by no means always, the underlying factor of neurosis or psychosis. It is futile to expect to relieve this type of case by seeking its origin in the relationships of the present persona with his parents and all that drugs or shock therapy can do is to mute the appeals for help being sent out by the stuck ghost. The appropriate treatment in such a case is, of course, to free the previous persona, and so relieve the present persona of its influence. This was common practice in the more enlightened civilizations and will, I hope, soon become generally accepted today. The second cause, upon to the confirmed materialist, and the most frequently selected, is immediately after the death of one body, urgently to set about acquiring another. He is usually in such desperate hurry not to lose his place in the queue that he grabs the first fertilized ovum he can find, diving into the womb as though into an air raid shelter. Had he come with due consideration from his integral, he would have taken considerable care to choose parents with whom he had already forged strong links of affection, or made sure that at least one member of his prospective family was congenial. Lacking this foresight, it is not surprising that only too often he finds himself either among total strangers or related by blood to people with whom his only links are links of hatred. Wow. This scurry from one body to the next, coupled with the fact that so many people cling desperately to outworn bodies because they think that without them they would cease to exist. It is the primary reason why the world is so rapidly becoming overcrowded. The R lectures. We used the first of these, titled Why I Believe in Reincarnation, to illustrate Joan's gradual discovery as a child that not everyone could remember previous lives, and her determination as she grew older to acknowledge her unusual gifts to the world, rather than pretend that she was no different from the majority. But what we didn't use was the conclusion, which is a splendid reiteration of everything that believing in reincarnation meant to her, and which she used again in a version of the same lecture given in 1969. This is the version we will quote at the end of chapter 1-2. The rest of the lectures are included in full. This is a very long chapter, so I'm doing a little bit more. Some aspects of far memory. When I read in the September issue of the ARE Bulletin that some of my books were physically received, I thought I had better begin this talk by explaining that the faculty of far memory is in no way concerned with information or ideas received from any outside entity. It differs from the type of memory which reminds me that I came to America on the Queen Elizabeth, only in that it is concerned with events which took place before rather than since my birth in 1907. The faculty is in no sense magical, mystical, nor supernatural. It is a result of energy expended in acquiring a technique by which a current personality can relive the experience of an earlier personality in the same series. In fact, like every other ability, far memory is the result of practice. The idea that some people are born gifted as though their abilities depended on the whims of good or bad fairies who were invited or not invited to their christening is suitably for a bedtime story, but totally inappropriate to the robust reality of reincarnation. For reincarnation is a robust reality, and we betray it unless we forthrightly accept entire responsibility for our past, our present, and our future. So we must accept that there are no gifts, there are only acquired abilities. The reason why I was born with the ability to remember a few incidents which I had experienced during the course of earlier personality is exactly the same reason why any other child is born with a skill or talent. During an earlier life or lives, the child has concentrated his energies to a degree where they produced something which he could and did take with him. The fine absence of any form of genius is by no means a sign of spiritual immaturity, for people often decide against bringing a talent with them when they incarnate, either because they wish to widen their field of activity or to climb a different, not necessarily a higher mountain to achieve a fresh point of view. Sometimes they leave a particular talent outside the range of their normal waking consciousness, so that they will not be tempted by their faculty into following an unhappy or already too familiar pattern. For instance, in Italy, during the 16th century, I earned a frugal livelihood as a strolling player, singing to a lute. Although I now have a keen appreciation of music and a good ear, I can neither sing nor even whistle, because I was determined that Joan would be unable to follow a profession which I had already learned would be, for me, unsatisfying. Long before I remembered any details of this strolling player life, which became the second autobiography I published, Life as Carola, Carola's experience was manifested in a certain aspect of my character. As a child, I used to creep down to the music room, which was well out of earshot of the bedroom, and practice the piano for hours during the night, because I thought that only by becoming a competent musician could I earn my independence. I had to practice in secret, for my father very rightly discouraged my efforts. He recognized that I had little to offer as a pianist except persistence. So I would never have been more than a mediocre or abhorred mediocrity, and he abhorred mediocrity. Because Carola literally had to sing for her supper, often to such a lethargic audience that she went supperless to bed, I cannot help sharing the anguish of an incompetent entertainer. So many people soon gave up taking me to pantomimes or the circus, for if there were a juggler who dropped things, or a clown suffering custard pies or buckets of water, I either wept or made a scene, however vehemently my embarrassed escort assured me that the mistakes were part of the act, and that the victims were making people laugh at them on purpose. Although in our present culture, the faculty of being able to remember earlier incarnation in detail is unusual, everyone shares the capacity of retaining the experience of their long history, for this experience is the essence of character. I can remember only about 40 incarnations, some in considerable detail, but this is sufficient to convince me that both the good and the bad aspects of my characters are, always have been, and always will be entirely my own fault. If this truth were more widely recognized, it would at least spare us from the wails of "it isn't fair." The acceptance of what I have been, what I am, and what I will become as being due to my own efforts or to my lack of effort may sound as though I were not profoundly grateful for the inestimable help I have received during many millennia from countless other people, people older in spirit, younger in spirit, and of my own level in the evolutionary hierarchy. But I could have received their benign assistance only if I had conferred similar benefits, in mind if not in degree, on somebody else first. This statement may seem a paradox, but this is only because we have got into the habit of thinking in terms which properly apply to things rather than people. Obviously, we cannot give a thing to someone else unless we already possess it. Yet there is a natural law, which I cannot prove but only affirm empirically, that a quality cannot become an integral part of our character until we have begun to direct that quality towards other individuals. This is why no one can be loved until they have learned how to love at least one other person, and no one can be happy, even momentarily, until they have made someone else happier. A great many people recognize that there are levels of activity outside the usual range of their normal waking consciousness, but, oddly enough, the majority of them seem to imagine that virtue is acquired by shifting the focus of attention away from the three-dimensional level. I have never been able to understand why this idea should attract so many people, because it seems as illogical as thinking that a man becomes somebody else merely because he travels from one floor to another in an elevator. I'm quite proficient at dodging about in time and space, but none of these travels have made any marked change, of any change at all, in my essential character. There have been occasions, of course, when on a non-physical level I have received salutary advice or a brisk bounce, but this is an entirely different matter. The shift of level in itself never has had, and I feel sure never will have, any effect whatsoever. To believe otherwise is as though one were to become so bemused by the brochures of travel agency that one genuinely expected to be a more pleasant, or at least a different personality after disembarking at several foreign ports during a cruise. Another aspect of far memory, which I understood only after cultivating the faculty for over 30 years, is that one can never remember the benign details of an earlier incarnation, unless the lesson one learned during that incarnation have already been absorbed into one's character. In fact, one remembers only when it is no longer necessary to remember. The reason for this is simple. Once one has been able to see it, the spirit of an individual is the sum total of all the loving and lovable aspects of a series of his personalities. Or, if you prefer it, the spirit is the storehouse of his accumulated wisdom, which, through his instinct and his intuition, are manifested as the benign attributes of his character. To record those earlier lives which became books, 10 of them, for there are 4 which, for various reasons, I have not published, I contacted my earlier personalities on the territory we share, the territory of the experience which was suitable for integration in our mutual spirit. This is why the I of these books is invariably so praiseworthy. Until I discovered the reason for this, quite recently, I found the uniformly good behavior of my earlier personalities more than a little embarrassing, and exceedingly irksome to my novelist imagination, which was never allowed to embellish the recall of earlier personalities, except to correct grammatical errors and to rearrange the episodes into chronological sequence. When making a recall, I provide a running commentary of the events and emotions, which, to the earlier personality, seem to be happening in the immediate present. Even a psychoanalyst would have become wearied by the search I made for sins I must have committed, for unkind jokes I must have made, for revenges which I must at least have contemplated. But I could not find any, because I was looking for them in the wrong place. For I was recording only those factors of earlier personalities which had already become integrated in my spirit, and the spirit contained only the experience which contributes to the individual whom we have become when we have reached the next stage of our evolution. This spirit, in fact, is the embryo of the God in man. After we have reached this stage, towards which every human being is gradually progressing, I think that the spirit will become the basic individual which, in its turn, begins a new evolutionary process. But such speculations are fruitless. To postulate the problems which we shall have to solve when we have become even the most junior of the gods is as though a dolphin tried to write a treatise on higher mathematics. But to return to the stage of evolution which immediately affects all of us, what happens to the aspect of a personality which are not acceptable for integration with the spirit? I believe that these aspects become split off from the rest of the personality in exactly the same way as situations which we refuse to tackle during our current lifetime get crammed into the laundry bin, which Freud called the unconscious. If they have been put there in the present incarnation, we can rescue them by changing the attitude which caused us to thrust them out of sight. Attitudes such as a false pride, false humility and self-pity being among the most common causes of dirty linen remaining unwashed until it causes sufficient nuisance to manifest as neurosis. I'll pause this here. Have a good 1st of March.